Welcome on my channel. This time to a reading of a short story that I wrote inspired by the computer game Valheim. So in the first reading I introduced Alrik, a strong Viking that got shipwrecked as the boat of his Viking clan burst in a storm on the sea. But Alrik got lucky and with the help of his gods, as he assumed, he got back to a shore where he is now wet and cold in a cave under a rock formation that he had found, and now he's struggling against the cold that creeps into his limbs. As the last action of the second chapter that I have read, he sorted some dry driftwood that he had found in the cave, and now he has got the difficult task before him to get a fire going. Unfortunately, he hadn't found any tinder, so he rubbed a dry stick on the stone for a very long time until he had collected enough chips for a small nest of embers. His pants and shirts were still too wet to use the fibers. He would only create a fire with wood on wood. That was now the task of survival. Alrik knew from experience that good preparation was everything. He might just have strength for one try, so he kept rubbing to make the tinder nest even bigger. Then he took some fairly straight pieces of wood and began vigorously rubbing them to create friction heat. Luckily, the wood was really very dry and a small plume of smoke was soon formed. Alrik was undeterred and continued for quite a while until a nest of embers of the size of a gold coin had formed. He thought that could work and carefully transferred the embers to his wooden nest. Alrik carefully blew on the survival spark. He knew he couldn't get impatient now. The smoke rose in his eyes, but he was not deterred. The smoke became thicker and whiter. He continued to blow steadily. And a small fire flickered, a flame came on and the wood tinder burst into flames. Alrik quickly had some brushwood on hand and the fire spread well to the dried wood. With thanks to Odin, Alrik crouched down by the now roaring fire and drove the cold from his bones. Some time later he had also dried his clothes on the warm stone. Since it was still raining, there was no point in dressing up again. He went looking for firewood in the cold wet several times because he would need enough firewood for the night to keep out the cold and animals. The fire would dry the pieces of wood he attached and would dry them to the point where the wood would burn, although not as well as the dry driftwood. He had really been really lucky with this cave he had found. So he spent a lot of time fetching wood, warming himself again, and then after he got dry and got more wood, it was a strenuous work, and soon he thought he had enough to gather for the night. In his now dried linen clothes, he sat next to the fire and remembered his friends who had died in the storm. He would probably never see a full 22 of his fellow tribesmen again. Alrik gratefully lay down by the fire and fell into a restless sleep. A person in a dark fur-coated looked from the beach towards the cave where Alrik was now lying asleep by the fire and nodded. A quacking noise and wild giggling woke Alrik from the restless sleep. The fire had burned down, but the embers still dimly lit the space under the boulders that served as a shelter. He held his breath and could hear the sound of feet on the stone he was sitting under. Alrik was sure that he was no longer alone. Completely motionless and still, he said to himself and mentally cursed himself for not having built an improvised weapon in the daylight yesterday. Neither a spear nor a heavy stone or branch were within reach. He could only hope that whatever was smelling, they hadn't noticed him. Then a boar broke through the undergrowth some distance away. Alrik retreated into the shadows of the cave. A small white-looking creature jumped out from the rock, its eyes glowing yellow in the night. The arms and legs were thin and long, and it looked like a grotesque child, this creature. It quickly threw itself at the boar and bit its neck just a few steps away from Alrik. From the other direction, a second of the creatures rushed forward with a stone in its hand and threw it on the boar and tried to smash the animal's head. Both fell into a wild bloodlust, and as soon as the animal stopped twitching, both creatures hit the body on the ground and large pieces of flesh were torn out. Alrik had to pull himself together so that no sound escaped him. The bestial display of violence, as well as the eating and tearing, made his stomach sink deeper. That could have been his head. He would have to be more careful in this unknown land, and he now knew he needed a weapon. That would be his first task tomorrow, once these monsters were finally gone. He waited a while after the two had dragged the rest of the boar away, and then he rekindled the fire and put a branch to the side that he could use as a torch for defense. Sleep was now out of the question, but luckily morning was already near and he could feel the dawn. As a brave warrior, he knew his strength and skill, and he was sure that he could use a spear to face two of these clumsy creatures. In retrospect, they seemed quite simple and uncoordinated to Alrik. Nevertheless, it would be an exhausting fight that he wasn't willing to forgo. The whole situation had a good side, however, because a lot of meat was left behind when the boar was mauled. Alrik gathered the largest pieces in the first sunlight and threw dirt over the blood area to prevent other hunters from being attracted. He wanted to be able to continue using his cave as a shelter, and so it wasn't right for him to have a pool of blood lying nearby. He made a second, smaller fire a little bit away from the stones and prepared the boar's meat there. Since he didn't know the creatures that had killed the animal, he let the meat roast for a long time until it was dry and tough. But he wanted to avoid an upset stomach or poisoning at all costs. His grandmother has taught him that something well cooked was usually better for the body. While the meat was sizzling, Alrik set about fashioning two long, straight benches into battle sticks. He was even able to tie them some flint with roots that he had found by the water to the tips. Those were two really good weapons that he had improvised. Also a few larger stones that he could use for throwing and hitting. Sorry. So he found a few throws for throwing and hitting, similar to the stones that one of the imps had used. Since he now had weapons and a stomach full, Alrik set about improving and camouflaging his dwelling. A few needle-studded branches and several trunks formed a view and windbreak. So the day went by very quickly and he hadn't even collected any new firewood yet. Just in time for the night, Alrik had finished all his tasks and was now sitting again by a smaller covered fire, which warmed him but wouldn't attract fewer curious animals. The next day would be spent exploring the surrounding area. He had to know where he was and what other resources there might be available for him in the area. His survival was now assured for now, but Alrik knew he would have to strive for more. After all, he was chosen by the gods, and he wanted to do justice to that. With the improvements to his shelter and the small fire he kept, Alrik was able to sleep much better that night. Several times he woke up because his hearing was playing tricks on him, and once he was startled when he felt the feeling of a short nightmare. His lungs filled with water, but otherwise the night was calm and he was able to regenerate well. As soon as the first rays of sunlight were visible, he put out the fire completely with some sand to avoid noticeable smoke and sneaked out. The task was clearly defined. He would spend half the day wandering inlands and keep an eye out for anything edible or useful. Then he wanted to turn back and be back at the cairn for the night. That was all that mattered. Not to lose his bearings, because he definitely wouldn't want to spend the night outside. After some thickets and bushes that Alrik worked his way through, about an hour later he found himself in a sparse birch and beech forest. The area reminded him very much of his homeland. He walked confidently with a spear in his hand and used them as hiking aids. On the way he found some mushrooms that he had clearly recognized as edible, and which were now waiting in an improvised fold on his shirt, along with a few berries for the evening campfire. Straight as Alrik was about to turn around to go back to the cave, he saw the shape of a house through the trees. Alrik immediately took cover and now approached covertly what he suspected to be a Viking settlement. He had no idea what would await him there, and so he preferred caution to everything else. He slowly stalked closer until he could see the houses as dilapidated huts. Some crooked fences suggested fields and possibly a stable with an enclosure. The ornaments on the huts and the gable decorations were completely unknown to him and were in ruins. Judging by the houses, the settlement had been abandoned for a long time. Alrik continued to carefully check out all the houses. There were a total of 4 cabins and a barn, but they were all empty. One house had a brick fireplace and even a door that was still hung and looked like a former home. After now, it was clear that neither people nor animals were lurking here, apart from a wild bee's nest in the barn, which he painfully noticed when one of the animals stung him on the arm. He set about searching everything carefully. Behind the fireplace in the main house he found an old box with a rusty hatchet, a hunting knife, 2 copper coins, a necklace made of bone, and around 20 arrowheads made out of flint, as well as 2 tendons that were covered in wax. Someone must have set up this camp here in case of an emergency or a return, but it hadn't been opened for a long time. He gratefully took the tools and immediately decided to make this house his new home. With a little work he would be able to make the hatchet into a usable tool, and now that he already had arrowheads and sneers, nothing would stand in the way of hunting boars like he had seen on the first day. He looked around the house and made mental notes about what needed to be done and in what order. First he would have to sharpen the hatchet and then repair the roof. He would have to gather wood for the night, but he had still seen split remains under the roof of the other houses. To prevent the house from catching fire, he would have to repair spots on the chimney, but that would be done quickly provided he could find water. The village had no direct water point or well. He wasn't sure if that was a problem, but why it was ultimately abundant. Without a water supply, he would had a hard time to stay there. So he decided to make the search for water his highest priority first. Just half an hour later, he had spotted a small stream by searching in a circle around the village. The stream seemed clean and drinkable to him. He also found some flint again, which he took with him straight after he was in the cool water and he had feasted on the water. The gods seemed to be very disposed towards him. Alrik thought he had found this village and the chance for a new start. Now there was a lot of work waiting for him to gain a foothold here and make the main house a real home. The next few days meant hard work, but he was happy to have been given such an opportunity. Alrik even took the time to make a bed out of needles, and thanks to the solid door and walls of the hut he was soon sleeping through the nights again. The shipwreck faded into the background because of the hard work he did every day to restore the village to its former glory. There was only one thing that worried Alrik. What should his job be here? The village would only be a stopover to regain strength and have a starting point. But what was he really supposed to accomplish here? At some distance of the village, a large raven with glowing red eyes sat in a treetop and seemingly watched Alrik's every step. A satisfied facial expression. Alrik didn't notice the animal. The days went by, and Alrik found his way around better and better. He further explored the area around the village and found some valuable resources. On the one hand, there was a hole in a steep wall where good stones were found for building. Then there was a clay hole not far from the stream, where he generously used it to repair the walls of the barn. He even dared to move the bee colony into a basket that he had woven from willow, which gave him a few stings and a slight fever in the evening, but he might be soon able to harvest something sweet. The river continued to provide plenty of flint, which Alrik used to craft more tools and arrows. He soon found a cave in the forest. He suspected there were raw materials there for making iron, but the entrance of the cave suggested that something lived in there. Was it really worth the risk? Long Alrik relegated this issue to a lower priority and lived his life in the village day by day. But it came more and more obvious that he had to do it. He wanted to get ahead by melting iron and working on the glowing metal. He had now a coat and shoes made of fur of animals that he had killed with his bow. He had also caught some rabbits and stored them in the barn as supplies. They produced very well there, but soon or later everything was done. He wouldn't move forward until he had explored this cave. Alrik noticed that something was pushing him. Summer had set in and the temperatures became warmer. At night he dreamed more and more often, a very special dream. A huge 12-foot horse stood on its hind legs and rode through the forest, seemingly surrounded by sparks and fireflies. Alrik dreamed of this sight again and again, and he wasn't sure whether it was a good or a bad omen. With his current tools, he was no match for the animal if it became hostile to him. Face to face and at the same time, he had nothing to offer. The animal should be a peaceful omen, he thought. Alrik wasn't sure what was expected of him. The urge to be prepared for everything, and therefore the task to penetrating the cave became more and more urgent for him. It was just past midday when Alrik crept through the entrance of the cave with his bow at the ready. He had kept one eye closed for a long time before entering and now switched from his blind to dark accustomed eye in order to be able to see something directly in the darkness of the cave. In front of him lay a natural white corridor that led into the stone. Whatever lived in this cave was apparently still here, because Alrik realized that the ground at the entrance was covered with fresh tracks. He had chosen midday for his exploration because he hoped whatever lived here might be sleeping at this time of the day and become an easy prey for him. From the footprints he concluded that it was a larger animal similar in size to a bear. With firm resolve he quietly walked forward into the cave, with a warrior's hurt. His heartbeat was pounding in his ears and seemed far too loud, but from previous battles Alrik knew that this was just the fever of battle getting to his head. In truth, he moved forward absolutely quietly. That was also his luck, because he found the cave troll sleeping on his bed. The sheer size of the creature, the muscular arms and legs, as well as the large club that lay next to the troll, had to be made of small trees and made really an impression on Alrik. So this was his test. He could see glowing crystals on the walls behind the troll, casting some light into the room. Also a small treasure could be seen behind the creature's bed. It gleamed with metal, but also some white bones. They may have come from humans, but it wasn't very clearly visible. Was this the fate that befell the village? And was he driving it again? Should he be the next one to the exact revenge for the villagers? Or would it then be fair to kill the troll in his sleep, or would the gods insist on a fair duel? Alrik wasn't sure. But he was sure that he would lose out in this case, and therefore decided that his task was certainly to send the sleeping creature to Helheim as quickly and painlessly as possible. But how should he do that? Just then, the troll rolled over in his sleep and turned his back to Alrik. He was very frightened, but could control himself not to give himself away. It was clear to Alrik that this was another sign from the gods, because the troll was now offering his neck and his neck freely. Alrik quietly placed the bow at the entrance to the cave with an arrow attached and took the axe in his hand. He slowly crept up to the troll. After a quick prayer to Odin, he raised the axe as if he wanted to split a tree. He swung with all his might and brought down the now sharp blade. The sharp metal cut through the flesh and hit between two vertebrae, causing the creature's spine to crack. Blood splayed in all directions and also on Alrik. He jumped back, blinded by the mist and the creature's lifeblood. The blade jammed in his neck so that he had to let go. The troll instinctively lashed out as the pain shot through him, but he missed Alrik by 2 human hands. Already Alrik wiped the blood from his eyes, and as soon as he could see again, he lay down, and then there was a screaming and writhing in pain from the creature. And now he shot one shot of arrow after another. The troll was bleeding so badly and was hit so deeply that he couldn't get back on his feet. The roar rang in Alrik's ears, reverberating through the cave, dazing him. Another 2 arrows found their way into the neck and head of the writhing troll, and soon its movement slowed. The agony was over. With a lot of goodwill, Alrik had killed this big cave troll. The bloodied warrior slid down with his back against the wall and, shaking with adrenaline, laughed. Laughing because of the joy of life and happiness that flowed through him. He had emerged from this battle unscathed, even though all signs were against him. He had risked everything, and now everything was won. The treasure, the cave, the crystals, the ores were all his now. The troll's body would certainly be able to be used, and from the strength he had to cut through the creature's skin, it was clear to him that he would have to tan its hide. If his axe hadn't been absolutely sharp, a cut could have simply been slipped off and would have been hit by the skin, but the variable angle, the sharpness of his improved weapon, and the force that he had put into this blow, thanks to the god, and the last few weeks of hard work and practice left the troll to no protection. There was a lot to do now. Alrik's mind was racing. So much to do. Where should he start? The raven with the red eyes rose quietly into the air. He waited at the cave's entrance for the outcome of the adventure, and now wanted to return to his master with a message. A few days had now passed since Alrik had killed the cave troll and secured the prey. Some treasures were found in the cave, among other things a rake, hose, and a sword. Also, there was in poor condition, but Alrik also found a few silver coins, several gemstones, and a crystal that can glow in the dark. He sharpened the blade and also the other tools. He stowed it in a shelf behind the fireplace. The entrance to the cave was now blocked by a hastily constructed door to prevent animals or other monsters from unexpectedly moving in. He now set about working on the iron vein, but since he didn't have a suitable tool until now, this turned out to be really difficult. In order to be prepared for the winter, Alrik had started to split wood every day. At the moment he only needed a fire for cooking, a lamp that he had built out of the clay, and resin provided him with the light. For some unknown reason, the grotesque wretches he met on the first day always carried large amounts of tree resin with them. 2 of the monsters had attacked him at the wooden hook, but he would knock them down easily every time. The sound had to attract them somehow. So today he was on guard while chopping wood, and had his bow ready to hand next to the chopping block. When a rustling sounded in the bushes, Alrik hit the axe into the block, quickly grabbed the bow and pointed the arrow at the bushes from which the noise had come. Unexpectedly, and for Alrik surprisingly, it wasn't a monster that came out of the bushes, but rather a red-haired woman with a child in her arms. When she saw Alrik pointing at her with the bow drawn, the woman stopped after 2 weak steps. Alrik put the hatchet in the belt in case that this was supposed to be an attack, but it didn't look like an act to him because the woman really seemed needy to him. So he put the bow down on the chopping block and walked towards her with the words, "Speak, woman, what is wrong with you?" But there was no answer that he could understand. The woman spoke in words he didn't know and pointed to the forest and the child. Alrik stopped directly in front of her and made a gesture that was supposed to show incomprehension. "I don't understand you, woman, but come with me to my house," he said to her and pointed to the hut while he felt the boy's head with his hands. The child was tormented by a high fever, and she only seemed to be able to stand on her feet through sheer willpower. He put the bow around his body and then went back and took the boy from her. With the child in his arms, the heat on his bare chest sensing, he led them into the hut. He was glad that he had made a second bed on a rim, so he put the boy there and grabbed a wooden bowl that he had carved, a piece of fur rag and a jug of water. He gave all 3 to the woman and gestured for her to apply cold compresses to the boy's forehead. As a warrior, he had learned some healing arts, and it was part of the warrior's knowledge to be able to help himself with wounds after a battle. He was able to rediscover some of the herbs known to his homeland here. He was also able to find a total of 4 of these herbs. 1 helped against mild pain, 1 against stomach and intestinal illness, a 3rd helped against fever, and the 4th could be used as a paste on small wounds to avoid infection. That was already a good supply that he had accumulated, and so he lit a fire and began cooking a decoction of the fewer herbs. He put it also in a little dried meat for strength, which he also offered to the woman. "Here, eat these, so that you can regain your strength," said. He told her and gestured from the plate to the mouth. The woman understood, nodded, and chewed the food weakly, but also found a dry piece of bread and Alrik still baked from grass seed he had collected. He gave this to her too. When the brew was ready, he first let it cool down. Now he could relieve her at the boy's bed. In the meantime, Alrik had put his shirt back on. The effort from chopping wood was some time ago. He gestured for her to go to sleep on the other bed. She hesitated, but then she looked him in the eyes and staggered to her feet and sat down on the other bed. It took less than a minute and she fell asleep from exhaustion. Alrik began to look after the boy. He continued to make compresses and poured spoonfuls of the fever mixture into the boy's body. That's how it was for everyone. That's how it was for the afternoon and also the night. Only in the morning did success appear and the fever left the boy's limbs. He was now sleeping peacefully and out of danger. She was already sleeping and Alrik studied her features in her sleep. This had to be the god's next task for him. for he was sent a beautiful woman and a boy who would have been his own from the look of his face. Alrik concluded that he should now look after them as a family. When the woman woke up early in the morning, she found Alrik asleep, sitting at the boy's bed. In the glow of the crystals he has shattered around the house. He was holding the boy's hand and his head was forward succeeded. She looked at him and she also thanked the gods that she had found this man and that he had welcomed her with kindness. She rose from the bed to check the boy's condition, but then she accidentally brushed against Alrik's leg, which startled him out of the sleep. She blushed at this mishap, but he didn't hold it against her and made room at the boy's bed when he realized her intentions. The boy was fine again and had a good night's sleep, she noticed. Alrik had withdrawn to give her space and was very surprised when the woman, who had now regained her strength, stood up in front of him. She pointed to the boy and said, "Dune," then pointed to herself and said, "Freya." Alrik understood and nodded. He pointed to himself and answered with his name, Alrik. She nodded to him and said his name again, Alrik. Then he reached for the strap of her tethered dress and let it slide off her shoulder. The material fell to the floor and Freya now stood completely naked in front of Alrik. She made sure to keep her arms at her sides so that nothing would obscure her view. Alrik was completely taken aback by this gesture and quickly understood her intention of offering him her body as a thank you, but that was completely foreign to him, because after all this was an order for him that he had received, so this should be a test of his willpower as a man, because Freya, who stood in front of him, was really beautiful. He didn't allow himself to look because he didn't want to embarrass her, but he had still seen enough to make him blush, and he could feel the blood rushing through his body. He turned around to the bed and grabbed the fur blanket that was lying there. He took 2 quick steps towards Freya with the blanket spread out in front of him, carefully to fix his eyes on her. He wrapped her in the blanket and pulled her to his chest, whispering her name, Freya and Dune, welcome, in his embrace. He noticed how all tension left her body and she began to cry quietly. Alrik held Freya for a while, then the stronger warrior lifted the woman off her feet and carried her to the bed. There he laid her on the bed, still wrapped in the fur, and lay down next to her, taking her in his arms again. They both fell asleep next to each other until the next morning. Early the next morning, all 3 were awake. Dune was fine again. Alrik looked for some skins and some material for Freya so that she could spin thread. Freya quickly understood what Alrik was planning and was soon sitting cross-legged in front of the house, weaving thorns and to mend her dress and Alrik's clothes. Alrik showed Dune along hands and feet how he could pick and collect the red berries from the bushes around the settlement. He showed the boy with a staggering, waddling gait that he was in front. The wildlings should be careful, and Dune had to laugh when he saw and understood those facial expressions. Alrik immediately went to Freya and let the boy do his work. He started towards something and say the corresponding words. Then he continued pointing at the accordingly and looked expectantly at Freya. Once she understood what he wanted from her, they both spent the rest of the day teaching each other vocabulary. Alrik quickly noticed that the grammar they were using was almost the same, but the words were entirely different, like a dialect only for all words. To make things easier for both of them, Alrik decided to use the language that the 2 uses and to take over that from the 2. Luckily, he was not only strong but also quite smart and could memorize the words well. After the first day, both of them were able to converse erratically. So the days went by. All kinds of preparations were made for the winter and the language was learned. In between, Alrik took some pieces of wood and showed Dune how to play Viking chess, which his father had often played with him before. From 2 baselines on which 5 logs were lined up, you had to knock over the opponent's log with 4 sticks. The game was really fun and helpful to train the hand-eye coordination that was later needed to handling stones and slings. Dune had a lot of fun playing with Alrik, and soon the boy would be able to rabbit catch with a sling. Freya watched the 2 of them longingly from the sidelines and was happy that Alrik took the time for her boy. The 3 grew closer and closer together, but in addition to Alrik being caught, now sometimes Dune had the dreams of the deer with the mighty antlers and the lights. During these nights, Freya would lie down in bed with the startled boy so that he could quickly fall asleep again. In these nights, Alrik missed Freya by his sides. Somehow the 2 of them had gotten used from the start to sleep in one bed and find it completely natural since the first night when Alrik had given a clear signal to Freya. Days turned into weeks, and sometime later the 3 of them got along very well and had grown into a close family. Freya admired Alrik's strong body, and in the evenings she often snuggled up to Alrik from behind and hugged his upper body to let her arms and hand rest on his strong chest. The fact that Alrik always leaned his axe against the headboard when he went to bed and slept facing the door calmed Freya and almost made her forget the hardships of her escape through the wilderness. At some point she had to tell Alrik the whole story and the truth. She was now more and more afraid of this day because she had grown to love her life in the village and with Alrik very much. Tomorrow, she thought to herself just before she fell asleep. Tomorrow I can still tell him. That's how it went for many nights. Yeah, so this was one of the short stories I've written. I haven't continued at that point to write it down because I wrote then other things, and as you perhaps know from my channel, I've got a lot of hobbies, and so I didn't wrote the story on. But I hope you had some fun while listening to my bad English. And yeah, thank you for listening in. Thank you for watching. If you want to play a really good computer game, give Valheim a try. It's really fun. And yeah, if you're inspired, then perhaps write your own short story and have fun doing so. Thank you for watching. Bye.